with a kind of a kickoff housing 101. And I think over the years that has always proven to be a challenging session because there is so much to know about affordable housing and how it is created. And so this year, Andrea and I decided that having been through this a bit and worked on this, that it would make a lot of sense actually for us to develop the presentation, which really means for Andrea to develop the presentation. So the good news is we have a really information-packed session for you. The perhaps bad news is that you are all guinea pigs because we've never done this before. So hopefully the timing is going to work. We will stay on after noon for questions. We will also be making this the slides for the presentation available that we'll have embedded in them lots of links to other resources. And so just view this as an introduction and an overview and just kind of a structure too, to be able to think about all of the different issues that come up as we try to address the affordable housing challenges that we face in our community. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea to get us started.
All right. Hello, everybody. I am Andrea Aldana. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership with Jay. And I am excited to test out this presentation. I've never done a Prezi before, so this will be fun. All right. So this is essentially what we are trying to cover today. We want to talk about what the heck is housing. When we're talking about housing, what do we mean? Why is it important? Who needs it? Or more importantly, how can you understand who needs it in your town? What can it look like? How does it get built? And what do we need to get the best housing in our region? And then we will wrap up. There are too many of us to go around the room and introduce ourselves the way we do in our peer group meetings. But this is just a snapshot of who is registered for today's session. We have representation from every town on the Lower Cape. And all of the boards and committees that we hope would join are represented here today, so that's great. We also have a few good interlopers from the Chamber of Commerce, a faith-based organization, some social service agencies, and also some other nonprofits that are looking at modeling our program in their communities. So welcome, everybody. I just need to move my controls here. Okay. A couple suggestions. We have a lot to cover. There are a lot of us. Some of you will have a lot of questions, which is great. Let's all agree that we're going to share the air. I particularly want to bring attention to balancing inquiry and advocacy. I think a lot of us in housing feel very strongly about housing topics, so do I. But this is really a learning space. And I think we might be sort of preaching to the choir if you feel the need to preach at all. So try and balance those two things. Jay, can you tell us a little bit about who we are?
Sure. So those of you who aren't familiar with the Community Development Partnership, we're a nonprofit community development corporation that has been around since 1992. We lead the Lower Cape in building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. And we do that by developing and managing and advocating for affordable housing, as well as nurturing the launch and growth of small businesses, and do all of that work in partnership with businesses, nonprofits, and government partners.
And we are your local CDC. So just to give you a little context, I want you to be aware that this training is part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute, but the Housing Institute is part of a broader umbrella program called the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. So these trainings are offered within an ecosystem. The purpose of the Community Housing Partnership is to increase the capacity of the Lower Cape to meet the housing needs of its residents. And we do that by supporting a couple of different buckets of people. The Lower Cape Housing Institute is the bucket that supports elected and appointed municipal officials and town staff so that we can help you all make the best housing policy decisions that you can make in your community. And the Housing Institute is made up of trainings, but not just trainings. We also really care about peer-to-peer learning opportunities. So we facilitate quarterly sub-regional peer group meetings in the Lower and Outer Cape. Last year when COVID hit, we switched to a monthly format And in December, we switched back to sub-regional. So we had our winter meetings already, and our spring meetings are going to take place in April. And you'll be getting invitations to all of this afterwards, so you don't need to remember too much. The Housing Institute also includes some other resources that people find really helpful. One is every year since we started the Housing Institute in 2017, we scrub all of the town meeting warrants on the Lower Cape for housing articles that are relevant, well, articles that are relevant to housing. And we offer that as an annual town meeting housing summary. And it helps us to evaluate the success of the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership, but it's also just a great tool for everyone to know what all the different towns are working on and what's passed in a given year. We also have a monthly Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership e-newsletter, and it's a rundown of everything that we know about that's going on in your communities from all of the 8 towns that we cover. And it's really the only place like it to find out this kind of information. And you can sign up on our website, but again, we'll be sending you the link if you're not already on it. I highly recommend it. And then we do monitor a private Facebook group for anyone who's gone through Lower Cape Housing Institute training. We don't post a lot to it, but it is a space for people to have some sort of private conversations around housing if you choose to. And so that's what we offer for municipal officials. I will also say that we started offering about 2 years ago housing coordinator services to several towns. We currently work with Harwich, Chatham, Wellfleet, and we're just in the process of contracting with Orleans on a mini project, not as a housing coordinator. They have a new wonderful housing coordinator of their own. So the second piece of the partnership is what we call the bucket for everybody else from non-municipal officials. We started off with advocacy training, and over the past year, we've moved slowly into more of a community organizing model. So I won't talk too much about that, but do know that we're working on building public support at the resident level as well. And then we have a public education campaign, which we'll be showing you later in the presentation, which is designed to, again, build public support for housing through a print campaign. Some housekeeping. Jay, I'm not sure if you mentioned this at the top, but we are probably not going to be able to answer questions throughout the presentation or else we're going to get derailed. So we're asking everyone to please hold your questions until the end. Well, you don't actually have to hold your questions. Use the chat feature. We are going to ask that people not raise their hand because for a group of this size, it's a little unwieldy. So as questions come up for you, please type them into the chat. And at the end, we're going to go through all of the questions and we'll stay on after 12 if we don't get to all of them by the end of the training. So we're going to try our best to get to all of your questions and we'll do it that way. We will, of course, be sending you a link to the presentation and whatever other follow-up resources that we refer to. Now, as far as taking breaks, it would drive me nuts if people paused a Zoom meeting to take a break. So if you need to take a break, just do so. You can mute your video and your audio if you like, but if you need to go do something, take care of yourself, please go for it. And we're going to keep moving forward to be respectful of everybody's time. All right, and let's talk a little bit about what housing is. So housing is safe, stable, and affordable, and it's the foundation for a healthy life and a healthy community. There are a lot of components that make up a healthy community, and housing is one of the most critical pieces of that. It serves a bunch of basic needs: physical for shelter, psychological for safety, and it also is where we live our lives, right? It's where our family structures and relationships get played out. So it's a social, it serves a social function as well. And housing can be a single family home, it can be an apartment, it can be a duplex. If you're asking the census, it could be a boat. There's a lot of different things that housing can be, but it should be safe, it should be decent, and it should meet your needs. We don't really have a community with a healthy supply of housing, but we can kind of speculate about what such a community might look like as something that we can strive for. So a community with a healthy supply of housing, meaning it has housing that serves the needs of the people who live there and the needs of the people who make up a vibrant community. It would be attractive, right? You would have a lot of different types of housing. So here on the Lower Cape, we see a lot of what's on the left, a lot of detached single family homes on 1 acre lots. And that doesn't look amazing. if you have a monoculture of housing. Really attractive, beautiful towns that we like to visit have a diversity of housing types. And we call that diversity this so-called missing middle housing. Because when people talk about housing, they have a hard time wrapping their head around anything other than the single family home or the high rise. And so they decide that other types of housing just don't fit here. But there's actually a lot of different types of housing, even on the smaller side, duplexes, fourplexes, that are historically relevant to our communities and have existed for a long time, can be very quaint and look beautiful. A community with a healthy supply of housing is also energy efficient because it adopts the values of village-centered development, which is another really, really common historical way of developing. So if you think about old historic towns, you have a lot of amenities and housing all around, say, a village square. But somehow we decided that when we want to preserve the quaint character of our communities, somehow that type of development pattern is no longer included. But it is the oldest type of development. And what's so useful about it is that it means that people live close to public transportation where they work and commerce. And that's how you build a walkable community. So communities that are walkable are energy efficient because people aren't driving everywhere. And also they look better because you don't have parking lots on the street and that's all you can see. And of course, really beautiful communities do have more energy efficient homes themselves. And housing affordability out here is definitely tied into the way that people are paying for their utilities. So a more energy efficient home is more affordable for residents as well. And then a healthy community is diverse because it includes housing types that meet the needs of diverse people, racially diverse, economically diverse, and diverse in terms of family structures. You cannot have this ideal that people say they want, which is young families, if you don't have housing that meets the needs of young families. So you need to have housing that is configured in a lot of different ways and at different price points for all sorts of different family structures, ages, and stages of life. So when we talk about housing, a lot of times we're focusing on affordable housing. And just to be clear, the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership is very much focused on housing production that is affordable, but we also think that towns need to be thinking about having a healthy supply of housing for people at all income levels, housing production broadly. Now, we could spend an hour talking about all of the different terms used to describe affordable housing, but we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're going to point you to this excellent resource. So Shelterforce is a community development publication, magazine, and they have a ton of incredible information around community development and housing. This is a glossary of affordable housing terms that I highly recommend you all print out and post next to your desk. But I also recommend that you subscribe to this magazine if you can, because it will give you not only a lot of food for thought, it'll help you be a little more cutting edge about the way that you think about housing production in your community. And it'll help you a lot with messaging, talking about housing, which is something that I know a lot of people really struggle with. But in a nutshell, housing is affordable if it takes less than 30% of a household's income to live in that home, and that housing costs include utilities. And just side note, for the longest time, I think at least a century, housing affordability was defined by 25% of your income, and the Reagan administration changed that in the 80s to be 30% for fiscal reasons. So my point in saying that is that 30% to some people is still actually kind of high. And if a household spends more than 30% of their income on housing, then they are considered to be cost burdened. And being cost burdened is a problem because it means that households don't have the resources to spend on other important aspects of a good standard of living, like education, food, basic things that we all need to feel safe and secure and be able to be productive citizens.
Andre, can I just say one thing too about this is that the importance of, if you're spending, and we have many of towns where a majority of households are spending, a majority of low income housing households are spending 50% of their income or more on their housing. So that means when there's an emergency, when there's a healthcare challenge, there aren't the funds to take care of that. And it certainly means that families aren't saving for the future or saving for their kids to go to college.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So it extracts the resiliency in your community. So like when a pandemic hits, we're scrambling to support them around emergency rental assistance, for example. And you might have heard of this big A versus small A affordable housing. So let's get into that. So big A refers to affordable housing that is regulated and that receives government subsidy, whereas small a does not. And small a is really not something that you find here on the Cape, but it is a normal thing in other communities. A lot of other communities do actually have a regular rental market, and people can find housing, by going on Craigslist or working with a realtor. Here, you pretty much need to find something through word of mouth because our vacancy rate is effectively 0. It's almost impossible to find something here that is naturally occurring. But we'll talk about this small a. So again, the important thing to know here is that it's not built with government subsidy and it doesn't receive any subsidies for operations. And so it is a home that's owned by the private sector. Now, capital A affordable housing is subsidized and therefore highly regulated by the state. And when we're talking about affordable housing, 40B is the thing that comes up. And again, we could have a whole training just about Chapter 40B, but we're not going to do that, although we have offered this in the past. So the important thing to understand is that for Chapter 40B is that it creates this comprehensive permit. It's the primary vehicle for permitting of affordable housing, and it's the #1 source of affordable housing production in the state. And the comprehensive permit is a permit that a developer can request from a town that will provide some zoning relief if the developer is creating affordable housing. And so it lets them produce more units than the site can hold by basically going above and beyond local zoning, but it cannot supersede state zoning. So all of the same protections for the environment, for example, still need to be adhered to. And there is a carrot in Chapter 40B for towns to have a little more control about which projects, which developers can get a comprehensive permit or not. And that is this 10%. You may have heard that like all communities are required to have this 10% of their housing be affordable. So something on that is that the 10% refers to the percentage of affordable housing in your year-round housing stock. So if you think about all of the housing stock in a community on the Lower Cape, a lot of that housing stock is seasonal, and that's not factored into this 10%. So the pie that you're starting with is just your year-round housing, and 10% of that slice needs to be affordable. And if you do hit that 10%, then when a developer comes along and requests a comprehensive permit, you can reject it. Not you, the Zoning Board of Appeals can reject it. Although we need housing, so please don't. But if you have not reached the 10%, then the ZBA cannot reject the permit. And there's still an appeals process after that, which we won't go into. But all of this is in the 40B handbook that MHP put out in 2017. And I highly recommend that you share this handbook with your zoning boards of appeal. It goes through the timeline of what happens as soon as a town gets an application for a comprehensive permit. And it's really quite stringent. But again, we don't have time to get into all of the details of that. And the way that we know if a town has achieved 10% affordable housing or not is through a tool called the Subsidized Housing Inventory. And people will usually refer to it as the SHI or the SHI list. And so that's literally a list of affordable units that are units that have been subsidized, and it's updated every couple of years, but I think DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, recently updated that list in December of 2020. What else do I want to say about that? So the other carrot, aside from achieving 10%, is that you can enter into safe harbor. A town can enter into safe harbor. And safe harbor means not only, if you haven't gotten to the 10%, you can go into safe harbor by having two things: a certified housing production plan. It's not enough to just have a housing production plan. You have to have it certified. And a percentage of housing production in a year. I believe it's 0.5% in 1 year or 1% in 2 years. Don't quote me on that, but it's a percentage of housing production. But that safe harbor needs to be reestablished on a 1 or 2 year basis. So those are the two ways to have a little more
Another way
control.
of thinking about that is like, if you are demonstrating that you are making progress in getting to 10%, you then have the ability to halt unfriendly 40B permits. So that it's basically the state is rewarding a town that is making progress and gives them a break on unfriendly 40B applications because they're demonstrating that they're taking their housing challenges seriously.
And I guess one last thing to say about the 10% is that we're waiting for the results of the latest census to figure out what all these numbers are for the town. So everything is in the process of getting recalculated. And then the other way that a lot of towns here have produced housing is through this LIP program. Basically, this means that a town has identified a project, a site, and they're working directly with the Department of Housing and Community Development to get some technical assistance. And then with some other criteria, they create what are called LIP units, and they can also count toward your SHI. Whoops, I got a little too far in. Am I done here? I think that was all I wanted to say about that. So let's go back. So more importantly, why do we not have a healthy supply of housing on the Lower Cape? A couple of reasons. One is that our local housing market really has nothing to do with our local economy, because housing prices are driven by other factors, primarily the salaries of people who live off Cape. But it's also driven by the cost of building. So because of our zoning, most of our housing stock is single family homes on 1 acre lots, and we have incredibly high land values here. So we are building the most expensive type of housing that can be built. And that doesn't help anyone. And this is a number that you might want to have in your hat, which is that it costs about $350,000 to build a unit, say in Boston, but it costs closer to $400,000. And more recently, I heard the figure $450,000 on the Cape. So it just costs more to create units here on the Cape. And then again, we have this dynamic of second homeowners with much higher incomes that are able to not only pay higher prices, but take advantage of opportunities as soon as they hit the market. And so they're not even available for year-rounders if year-rounders are able to learn about them. And I think I saw that more than half of the vacation homes in the state are all on the Cape. And then, of course, we have our short-term rental market with Airbnb and just the way that people like to vacation out here. The dynamics are that it is far more profitable for property owners on the Lower Cape to rent out their homes on a seasonal basis than it is to rent out their home to a year-rounder for an entire year. And the seasonal market has really eviscerated the ability of our region to have a year-round rental market. And one really stark example is Provincetown. So if you haven't read it, I recommend that you check out this study that they did recently. But the gist of it is that they found out that the difference between renting out a unit seasonally for, I believe it's 20 weeks, and renting it out on an annual basis to a year-rounder is a gain.
And a market rate rental.
Market rate, yep. Is a gain of over $18,000. And they still get to use the unit on the weekends or in the off season. Whereas if you rented it out year round, you wouldn't get to do that. And so there just really isn't any incentive for a property owner to rent to someone year round when they can get these benefits. And then, of course, we've heard that there is an impact from COVID. We don't have the data to quantify that impact just yet. But if you talk to realtors, you've probably heard that our very hot market is just getting hotter and that homes are selling at above asking price. And it's just even harder to find a rental. But we're waiting on data to quantify that. So I want to take a second to talk about the affordability gap. This is a tool to help us describe the stress on our housing stock. And the affordability gap is an indicator of housing stress, right? It represents a number of existing households who are spending 30% or more of their income on housing and are expected to be home cost burdened. You can go to the Cape Cod Commission to get some really great visual data on affordability gaps in our community, but I just want to quickly run you through 2 examples. So what we're saying here is that there's a gap here between what is available and what people can afford, right? So if we look at Harwich, for example, all I want you to take away from here is that if you look at the bottom, we have a couple different income brackets, 50% of area median income, which is lower income on the left, and 120% of area median income, which is higher income on the right. And we're seeing that this housing cost burden exists for people at a variety of income levels, including the higher income levels. And it's just something to keep in mind as you're talking about affordability issues on the Lower Cape, is that yes, there's always going to be a need for housing for people who are at 30% of AMI and 50% and 80%. And there is also a need at 100% and 120%. And if you're in Provincetown, for example, up to 200%. And the dynamic on the Outer Cape just gets worse. So this just gets harder and harder the further you get from the Mid Cape. But I just wanted to show you how it's interesting that there's this this dynamic where homes are cost burdened at higher income levels. And this will help you figure out how many units are needed to meet the gap in your town. Jay, did you want to add something about the affordability gap?
Yeah, just kind of 2 things I want to say. So another way to think about this affordability gap is, so if the median house price, say in the town like Truro, is $750,000, in order to go to a bank and get a mortgage with 10 or 20% down to purchase that house, you'd need to have an income of $140,000 a year. And we know that the number of people in the town of Truro who have a household income of $140,000 or more a year is very small. And so one of the goals then of trying to deal with housing affordability is, how do we close that gap? How do we make it so that housing, close that gap between what the cost of housing is in the market versus what people can afford? I think the other thing to remember about this affordability gap challenge, though, too, is that I think sometimes we get a little bit lost and think, oh my God, this is just a terrible crisis on Cape Cod and we're unique and special and nobody else has this problem. And actually, this is a problem nationwide. There are only 200 counties in the United States. So remember, there are 200 counties in the state of Texas alone. So there are only 200 counties across the country where median income and median home prices and rentals match. But otherwise, there are affordability gaps to varying degrees in a vast majority of counties across the country.
Thank you. And then some other really basic things to quickly go over. We're here because of zoning, right? Our housing affordability issue is the result of years and years of poor land use policies. So basically, the housing stock that you get is what is easiest to build through zoning. And what's easiest to build out here is single family homes on 1 acre lots. We make it very difficult for people to add so-called in-law units, which are accessory dwelling units. We add permit caps, even though really more expansive ADU bylaws still don't even yield that many units. So we should be as unrestricted about those bylaws as possible and not have people jump through hoops. And there are very few, if any, places on the Cape or on the Lower Cape where you can build multifamily as of right. And multifamily refers to having more than one unit in a structure. So it could be a duplex, it could be apartments. And that is really the most cost-effective way of building affordable housing. And we can't do it. And then, of course, because we need to protect our beautiful resources, we can't build a lot of housing if you don't have infrastructure to deal with that housing in terms of municipal water and sewer. So infrastructure is connected to density. If you don't have public water or you don't have sewer, then your allowable density is lower, which again makes the cost of construction much higher and makes it difficult for you to build multifamily, if at all. And then a big category is a lack of public support, but I would say actually it's the perceived lack of public support, because what I've learned in the years that I've been running this program is that there is actually a lot of public support because there's a lot of people that need housing and they support housing production. But they can't show up at meetings because they're working multiple jobs or they're taking care of children, or they're afraid to come to your meetings because they're very stuffy and difficult to engage with. So you really need to be thinking about how you are engaging your residents to make sure that you're getting diverse input. There's a study that came out of Boston University that analyzed who goes to town meetings, committee meetings, not just annual town meeting. And it's found that individuals who attend are generally older, male, longtime residents, generally white, and they're really representing a very specific and narrow point of view, and they're not fully representative of our communities. So we need to, as municipalities, we need to go out of our way to structure our meetings and structure our communication with residents in a way that is more inclusive.
And that data from that study came out of analyzing hundreds of zoning board hearings that involved housing decisions. So remember, so many housing projects are going to end up before a ZBA. And unfortunately, often that public hearing process is not, the people who participate in it are not representative of the entire community, and therefore skew the decisions that zoning boards often make.
And then, of course, there's NIMBYism. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And the reason why I bring this up here is that one of the great things about NIMBYism is that it looks the same everywhere. So it's highly predictable and easy to plan for. And it generally falls into one of these categories. So I'm not going to read all of this, but again, this is a resource for you to come back to. What I want to bring attention to is how to deal with these issues. So yes, there are fiscal claims. You'll hear a lot of comments about how housing is going to bring up our taxes and make infrastructure more expensive, even though a lot of our communities are actually planned for peak need, which is for summer residents and not for year-round residents. But the point here is more, before you go into a hearing, have facts around projected capital improvements, for example, in these different areas, so that as soon as they come up in a meeting, and they will, you can go after them and say, well, actually, here's some data. And so what you're suggesting is not actually borne out in fact. So remember, you can always come back to this presentation. Traffic. Traffic is apparently the worst thing in the whole entire world. Everyone is very, very concerned about traffic, but well-sited housing should minimize traffic, right? So again, make sure that you get the data before a hearing and come ready to talk about why traffic may or may not be an issue. But more importantly, if you're really concerned about traffic, just get a peer-reviewed study and make sure that your ZBA members believe that study and take it as fact, and don't just rely on anecdotes from residents about the dynamics of a particular intersection, because you can just know for a fact what the traffic implications of a development will be.
Let me give a good example of that. When the potential affordable housing project at the Teton site on Route 6 in Eastham was before the ZBA. There were tons and tons and tons of public comments and concerns about having 50 to 100 households living on Route 6 and driving on Route 6. And so what a traffic study showed was that actually having housing there was one of the least traffic intensive uses for that property. And that if you had that property used for retail or some kind of commercial purposes, that was going to generate way more traffic movements than housing would.
And then, of course, you're going to hear people be very concerned about density of any kind. And density is really a red herring. It's not a useful way of discussing a housing development. So as soon as you hear people saying, well, that's going to be too dense, think about what they're really saying. Because what is and is not too dense is socially constructed, is based on a person's own beliefs about what should and should not be. And generally it's arbitrary. It generally has nothing to do with the number of units and has more to do with how those units are going to be configured and what they're going to look like. So a lot of people will say that's going to be too dense, it's going to be ugly. Well, those are two separate things. You can have high density that still fits within the character of your community. And in fact, a lot of the places that we all like to visit are quite dense. So density and quaintness do go together. But more importantly, when people are talking about density, it can be really useful to reframe the conversation around cultivating a sense of place and focusing on design. And the Cape Cod Commission had a really great project a few years ago called the Community Resiliency by Design Project. And it included a visual preference survey for the towns that were involved in that study. I know that in our region, Orleans and Eastham were included, and I think it was Barnstable, Sandwich, and Falmouth, if I'm not wrong, were also included in that. But what I thought was really interesting, because I went to the visual preference survey session in Eastham, was that different communities have a different, agree differently on what fits and does not fit into their communities. And they don't all believe the same thing. So actually in Eastham, a lot of people agreed that more modern architecture does fit into the Outer Cape. And in Orleans, people generally felt like that was less the case. So don't assume that everyone has the same idea about what a place should and should not look like. But more importantly, don't focus on how many people are going to live in the buildings. It makes perfect sense to think about what your community is going to look like, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with who lives there or how many people live there. And then the people category, those people, there's a lot of coded language that comes up in a public hearing. Look out for it. I would say call it out if you can, because it makes people really uncomfortable and kind of shuts that down really quickly. There's a lot of racism and classism and bias that comes out in a public hearing, and I think it's perfectly acceptable to identify that. But something to keep in mind is that we need to be allowing for housing that serves people who don't just live here, because if we're so obsessed with having young people live here, that means that young people need to have a place to come back to, and they don't already live here. So you can't both want young families to live here and not want to have housing for people who don't live here. Those are antithetical ideas. So those people are generally the people that we want and need in our communities, regardless of who they are. I think that was my last. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about who needs it, Jay.
All right. So we're going to try to provide some data in this section. But I think what I want, what beyond that, I really want to give you some resources about where you can find the data and the stories and how to create a narrative of what the need is in your individual community. So let's talk a little bit about some of the data that's out there. So there are lots of different places where you can find data related to housing. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development on the federal level The Cape Cod Commission has lots of good information, including the regional housing market analysis. There's also a website that they operate called Stats Cape Cod that can give you individual town by town data on various aspects of housing needs. The Massachusetts Housing Partnership has a Center for Housing Data. It's also an online resource that can provide you with really good data. But I think the thing to do here is to really try to help people help yourselves making housing communities, but also trying to understand what the regional housing market is. So you can see that this is a chart that talks about one of the big dynamics that we have in our community, and that is that the role of second or seasonal homes place versus year-round homes. And one of the things you can see in this chart is how the growth in new homes and trying to accommodate growth in our communities is all largely in seasonal homes. We're actually losing year-round housing in our communities. You also need to try to understand the needs of housing in each community. So pretty much every town on the Lower Cape has created some sort of document or plan that outlines what the housing needs are. And it's really, really important if you're going to be working, serving on a board that has to do with housing, that getting a hold of the latest housing production plan or analysis of what the various housing needs are in your community is really, really important, so that you can be making decisions and setting priorities that are based on data in your specific community. So one of the big factors when we talk about housing is this term called area median income, or AMI. And that's the midpoint of a region's income distribution. It's not the average, it's the middle. And so when you select, so for example, in Barnstable County, and the data for calculating area median income is published every year every spring by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it is published on a county by county basis. So it is important to recognize that clearly there are variations between the Mid-Cape and the Outer Cape, but what this whole system is built around is the county figure. And so that in Barnstable County, the median income for a family is $96,600. So that means half of all families in Barnstable County make more than $96,000, and half make less than $96,000. So in terms of then trying to describe need around housing, we tend to categorize housing units by low income, extremely low income, very low income, and then extremely low income. The extremely low income is what we call the 30% test. And so you can see in this chart, of course, it varies by the number of people in a family, but that is kind of often housing units that are created with government subsidy will receive funding from a funding stream that is targeting a specific income area. So for example, one of the requirements that the state has is that in any affordable housing unit that's going to receive state subsidy, is that 13% of the units in that development need to meet the needs of extremely low income residents. So that's a single earning less than $20,000 a year. Many of the units that are created using the low-income housing tax credit program are targeted at 80% of area median income. So that's a family of four living on $48,300, or 80% of area median income. And that kind of 80% is the threshold for what we call affordable housing. The figure there for a couple is $61,850. I think, though, that one of the keys to trying to tell the story of who in our community needs housing, though, is to take these figures and translate them into an hourly wage. And so a family that's living on $33,000 a year, that's that very low income. Those are typically people who are not working, that are living on Social Security or Social Security disability insurance or other benefits. Whereas somebody who's at a 50% unit, 50% of AMI, that's somebody who's making $20 an hour working full-time year-round. So this chart from the Cape Cod Commission, I think, is really, really helpful in that it kind of breaks down for different occupations how many income earners it would take to meet a median home value of $512,000, or to be able to pay a rent of $1,100 a month. And so that you can see that, in many of our communities where people are working in the hospitality sector, it takes, it's very difficult for a sole income earner to be able to afford. They really need 1.5 earners in order to afford $1,100 a month, or you need 4 people in order to afford a $500,000 home, which is a typical price for a home in our community. And so certainly, that situation improves as wages go up if you're working in construction or in an administrative kind of a job. But you can still see that for many of the occupations in our community, again, these are people who are working full time, still can't afford to live here. So as I said, yes, the data is really important, but I think what most resonates with people trying to understand why it is we need to be creating housing that is more affordable in our community are the stories. And so great ways to do that are to talk, to collect and share local anecdotes about different people who play vital roles in our community, such as the first responder, or a big sector portion of our population are seniors, or even just municipal employees who are trying to make our town halls function, who are paid good wages, but still are really challenged in trying to live here. So we put together a media campaign 2 years ago called "We Can't Afford to Lose the People Who Can't Afford to Live Here," that tell the story of a school teacher, a firefighter, and an employee of Outer Cape Health Services, all of whom experience severe housing challenges in our community. We also last spring put together a video for Provincetown's Harbor Hill housing project, which tells the stories of several of the residents of Harbor Hill. That's a really unique year-round market rate housing development that the town of Provincetown has created to meet the needs of people above 80%, all the way up to 200% of area median income, who can't afford rental housing in Provincetown. And so thanks to Harbor Hill, we now have 28 families who can live in units that are affordable to their income. And you can see that video on the town of Provincetown's website. And several other towns have produced their own mini videos. I think it's a great way to tell that story. So again, data is important, and some people really kind of get into data and numbers. But I think a lot of times it's really the story, a story that's visual, that includes a little bit of data, but using infographics, reports, maps, different tools is really a much better way to tell the housing story in your community.
Yeah, Jay, I would just add that if you don't have the capacity to do this in-house, that the Cape Cod Commission can be really helpful in developing visuals for you to use for your community. And Jay, when you were saying that the housing crisis affects people with middle incomes across the country, this is a really great article that kind of lays out the reason. Again, subscribe to Shelter Force. Okay, so what can affordable housing look like? Well, it can and should be beautiful, right? There isn't any reason why housing that's affordable to the people who live and work here year round should not be of the same quality as people who have second homes. It costs the same to build it, and it should meet the same needs of all humans. And something that people, I think, don't realize when they get concerned about the term affordable housing is that they might be thinking about large scale, low income public housing. And that's just really not how housing is built anymore. The name of the game now in affordable housing is diversity, particularly diversity of incomes and diversity in every sense of the word. Fair housing still does apply. And I think a lot of people feel like housing should only be built for people that already live here. But we talked a little bit about from the young families perspective, if that were the case, then we would only have communities full of seniors. And while seniors are fantastic, it's just one demographic to have in a community that requires diversity to be vibrant and healthy. So I would say that while there's the concept of senior housing meets a definite need and is really palatable, it's not diverse, and seniors, just like anybody else, want to live surrounded by lots of different people. And so senior housing can be a little bit exclusive, and certainly it excludes children, so it doesn't allow for young families to live here. So when people say that it's going to be ugly, the great thing is that we can point to a lot of beautiful examples right in our backyard. From Stable Path to King's Landing and Brewster, you know, it looks like it fits into the community, and it was created because of community input as well. So developers do keep architectural context in mind when they're developing something. And I just want to point to this energy efficient LEED Platinum certified development here, Thankful Chases Pathway in Harwich, is a property that the CDP developed. And while we're very proud of it, you can't build it anymore. And perhaps you shouldn't. You can't build it anymore because the funding is not available anymore to do the energy efficiency that we were able to accomplish here. And also, it's not sited in the village center. It's sited in a location where we were easily able to build. But it should be just as easy to build this type of housing in a village center where people can, you know, live more affordably because their utilities are lower and they can walk to work. Wouldn't that be amazing? So when you're talking about housing, always include pictures, examples of what's already existing in your community, because a lot of people won't even know that it's affordable. And affordable housing can be a little denser, and density is really good. I think the important thing that I want to say about density is it is the only way that we can build enough housing to meet the needs of our communities. But a thing that people don't realize is that they think of density as being in contrast with open space groups, the values of open space, environmental protection. But density is the way that we get to protect our environment. You know, the Cape Cod Commission through their study showed that we do have enough land on the Cape to build housing to meet the needs of everybody that lives here. And therefore, we would just be suburbia, right? We wouldn't be able to have the open spaces that we all love and that attracts us to this unique place. But by building more densely, by having the same number of units on less land, we can have more environmentally friendly development. We can protect open space, and we can have the beautiful communities that people are attracted here for. You actually need to have density in order to take care of the environment. And so we shouldn't be working against open space and conservation groups. We should be working with them because we do agree on that value. It's also much more cost effective to build. Jay, do you want to add anything there?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. All right, so how does it get built in a nutshell? Jay, take it away.
All right. So building it is really complicated, and it takes a lot of time. And particularly those of you in the room who have been involved in housing for a long time know the experience of how long it can take. Some projects have taken 5 to 10 years to get in to move forward. A project that is was just recently approved in the town of Truro for 40 units was before the ZBA for a year. And one of the big things to remember is time is money. And so the longer that it takes, the more difficult that it is to assemble all the pieces, the more expensive. And so a big thing to think about is the feasibility of building a project really is a balancing act. You've got a lot of different variables, from land costs to construction to design requirements to making sure that the infrastructure exists. You know, the water, the sewer, the roads, all the legal and financing costs. I mean, for example, that project that Andrea talked about that we built in Harwich, Thankful Chases, has 9 different funding sources that all have different requirements and all took a process of securing them. And so all of that, all those variables are really difficult. And so the more that we can make those processes more predictable or easier to move through, the easier it's going to be able to build housing and to do it at a more effective cost.
I would also say that the more that you've done to create a culture of support in your community and signal acceptance and, you know, embracing affordable housing in your literature and your town website is going to also increase the number of responses that you get to your request for proposals. Developers want to work with towns that want to work with them. Jay, I think we're doing well on time. Do you want to go through any of these other bubbles?
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about development timeline and highlights. So the first thing I want to say is partnering with developers is critical. And I think often on the Cape, people view developers as evil and they're going to ruin Cape Cod. When it comes to creating affordable housing, though, developers are our friends. The more that we approach them as town government from a position of strength and partnership, the better we're going to be able to get our housing needs met in that community. And I think another thing, really important thing to remember too, is that developers build housing and towns should not. One of the biggest reasons for that is that towns fall as a municipal building project come under prevailing wage. So if a town is building housing, it is way more expensive than the $400,000 per unit that Andrea just described. And so it's really the town's role in creating housing is to provide resources, provide infrastructure, provide guidance and support, but really to position themselves in a partnership with developers to create housing. So there are a whole bunch of different components in the development timeline. So the first is planning. So it's really important to take that town housing needs assessment and really analyze what the implementation capacity is, and to have some realistic goals and strategies for achieving new housing. And so, coming from that place of having an understanding of what the needs are and what the steps are to move forward, and having an action plan is really critical for positioning the municipality to be able to be in a place to partner with the developer to build something that the community wants and that the developer can feasibly develop.
And Jay, I just want to add that the difference between an action plan and a housing production plan, every town has a housing production plan. I don't think any of our Lower Cape towns have an action plan. An action plan is typically a document that's produced with a consultant for your affordable housing trust. And it's different from a housing production plan because it says exactly how many units you're going to create, when, who they're going to serve, and what funding you're going to need to have in place in order to accomplish those goals. And it comes attached to a budget, usually a 5-year budget that you can then review. And so it'll tell you if you only have $1 million in your trust, for example, and you want to build 400 units, you're obviously going to need more than $1 million. And so you need to be having a fundraising plan in place, working with your CPA to find those dollars.
So then you need to really have a development strategy, and there's a great resource in the housing toolbox that Mass Housing Partnership maintains that can help you put together a development strategy and a budget for what resources the town can bring to the table. You know, any project that is created is going to cost way more than a town could possibly afford. And that's why we have a whole bunch of different subsidy programs. But the key is by the town bringing some resources to the table, it indicates to those state and federal public funding sources that there is town support. But it also enables the town to play a strong role in determining what that project looks like and ensuring that it's going to meet the needs that you've uncovered through your housing analysis and housing production plans. And so that those municipal resources are what are needed to leverage significant investment. So a development strategy is going to outline, it's going to outline the who, what, where, and how of the community's housing needs. And it's really an extension of that initial needs assessment. So before you even think about a specific project, there's a whole bunch that needs to be done in pre-development. So say we've got a piece of land that the town owns or that the town has purchased. So there needs to be an evaluation of that site, a review of local and state guidelines, coming up with a preliminary conceptual design for that site, like how many, you know, what will the units kind of look like? You know, will they be all one building? Would they be a series of townhouses? Would they be a different mix? And then what the feasibility is, like how many units and how many bedrooms can you get that on that site? And is it enough for a project to be financially feasible? And will that project fit into your broader strategy? How much money is the town going to need to invest in that project? And one of the things to think about that too is, you know, even though compared to many communities in the Commonwealth, Cape Towns have a lot of different resources and a lot of resources to contribute to housing, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the fact is, but the more a town can put into a project, the more that we can ensure that the kind of housing that we want in terms of the way it looks, how it's sited, and what income levels it meets, the more control and influence we can have over that, what that project looks like at the end. So once the town, say, has a piece of land that it wants to make available, the town can't just go out and hire a developer to build that project. Because this is a municipal resource, it has to be put out for competitive bid with a request for proposals. We're going to be having a training on how to put together an RFP. I mean, several towns have already done this. But there'll be a really good training on how to put together an RFP and the different guidelines for writing the RFP. Writing an RFP is really complicated. I think one of the most important things to do, to remember, is that a group of volunteers on a housing trust or on a housing committee should not be writing the RFP. There are lots of resources out there, consultants or town staff who have experience, who can work with you and listen to what your needs are, but make sure that you put together an RFP that will meet the requirements of the law, but ensure that you get proposals that are going to address the various needs and qualities of the housing that you want. And you're going to really need to, an RFP is a document that really has to balance lots of competing forces to be sure that you kind of get the housing that you want. Then once you have an RFP and you get proposals, make sure that the group of people who are evaluating the proposals and selecting the developer have the skills and expertise to make the best decision. And again, I would argue that this is really important for local volunteers to have a role in and participate in, but there are consultants and experts out there that can really help the town who've done this before, who have lots of experience, who can identify different minefields or different problems in a proposal and make sure that you select a partner who's best going to be able to meet the town's needs around housing.
And Jay, the RFP, it's not just about making sure that it doesn't have problems. It's also about making sure it's expansive enough to allow for more than one bid.
Right. You know, I mean, a good RFP is going to strike this balance between articulating a vision, but not being so prescriptive that it is impossible to build. And that's a delicate balancing act. But you want a good RFP that was also going to inspire creativity by good developers to figure out ways to meet the local needs. So once a project has been awarded, the developer is going to start constructing that project. And now here, this is really though when the role of the town is diminished. That sure, the building department of a local town will be inspecting that project and will be overseeing it. And you know, it could be like, so for example, in a small town like Truro, building a 40-unit project, that's a big project. And the town building inspector maybe is so used to just inspecting single-family homes. But there may be a role for the town to go out and get a little bit more expertise to make sure that in overseeing the construction, that this all happens in the right way. But it's also important. Then there are other roles around the marketing and the lease up, the management plan, how the whole unit is marketed and the outreach is done. One of the most important things to remember here, though, is the folks who are really going to be focused on making sure this is done right is not necessarily the town. It's actually the state and the investors. Let's be frank. If the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is putting tens of millions of dollars into a project, DHCD has the mechanisms to vet the proposal and make sure that this is done right. It's going to be managed correctly, that it's going to be marketed correctly and rented up correctly. And fortunately, there are other entities that are looking into, that are kind of overseeing these functions, that the town doesn't have to play the starring role in that. And so then finally, the last phase of the development process is the occupancy and then the kind of ongoing operations. And so keep in mind that while the town, say the Community Preservation Committee or the Affordable Housing Trust may be putting some significant revenues into this project, the reality is it's not until all of the funding is assembled for that project that then all of the funds are going to come together to make that project happen. And so again, the primary funders of a project really are going to make sure that it's all coming together correctly. And I would argue that community preservation committees or housing trusts don't need to be investing tons of resources and energy and effort into making sure it's being done correctly. That's going to be taken care of by the state and other investors. A key part of affordable rental properties is the whole function of property management. And there are kind of two different models for that. there are several large for-profit affordable housing management companies, and many of the big developers either manage the properties themselves, or they bring in private, or they'll bring in a company to do the management. And while certainly a lot of those companies have expertise and skills and experience, they don't necessarily have local contacts and local accountability. And so I think there is, and there are a lot of good jobs that are involved in affordable housing management that in a big off-Cape for-profit developer, those jobs are going to be in Boston and New York and other places, not here on Cape Cod. And so I think there are some real advantages of looking at using an organization like the CDP or Community Housing Resource or other entities that can do that are going to do the management locally and will be accountable to the community. And then finally, I think one of the important things too, particularly for lower income, very low income units, is to ensure that there are partnerships with local social service agencies, so that when families are experiencing financial distress or having other challenges in their lives that threaten their housing stability, that there are local partners available to provide those kind of support services and help a family access rental assistance or fuel assistance or supplemental nutrition assistance programs or job training or healthcare, so that a family can be stable and financially healthy and stay in that unit. So funding sources, as I said earlier, the funding sources are really complicated, but they fall into two different buckets, local funds and state and federal funds. So let's talk about local funds. So local funds are not going to be, are basically going to represent between 5 and 10% of a project's total funding. And those local resources can come about both in cash, but also other assets. So for example, land. Many projects are built on on land with a 99-year ground lease to the developer. But if you can provide the land, which is really expensive here on Cape Cod, that is one way that contributes to a project's feasibility. Then we also have a number of different municipal buckets that help support housing production. The Community Preservation Act and affordable housing trusts. We also have local home and community development block grant funding. We've also seen towns use free cash from their town budgets to put into housing trusts and different housing projects. Orleans puts 1% of its annual budget into its housing trust every year. The town of Truro has put free cash into its housing trust in several years. And then we also have the prospect of several new sources of revenue that are now available to municipalities that I think it's really important for us to ensure some of those funds, if not all of those funds, are going into helping to meet our community's housing needs. And that includes the local option for the short-term rental tax. Last year, the 4 out-of-Cape towns of Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, and Orleans brought $3.8 million in additional revenue from short-term rentals. Now that Airbnb and VRBO, the rental of homes on a short-term basis, are now taxed in the same way that an inn or a B&B or a motel or a hotel is taxed. And then there are also 2 initiatives that are currently before the state legislature to provide more resources. One would be a transfer fee on the sale of homes in excess of $1 million, and then also an increase in the deeds excise fee that would provide resources to municipalities, both for housing production as well as climate resiliency, and something called the HERO Act. But a vast majority of the funding that helps create housing comes from state and federal funding sources. The biggest of which is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit program. This is a This is a funding source that sells tax credits to investors who then put equity into a project. A great resource to learn and understand the low-income housing tax credit program is this website, navalco.com, and I'd highly recommend checking it out and learning more about how the low-income housing tax credit program works.
We've also, rather than including the alphabet soup of all of the different funding sources that will mean nothing to anybody, we've included some links where you can go see that list and learn more about them individually.
But again, a developer is going to be well versed in all of those projects, all of those sources, and developers are really going to know how to bring all that financing to the table, thanks to the town's initial investment. So one example of how a town, though, was able to leverage significant resources to create 65 units of housing is the Village at Nauset Green. And you can see that's a project that took 4 years to create, from the time that the RFP was issued to when units were occupied. This is the project that's actually right outside my office window here, where 65 families now work. But that total project for 65 units cost $23 million. And you can see, though, of that $23 million, there was significant investment by the town of Eastham and the neighboring towns of Orleans and Wellfleet put some of their CPA money in it. But that roughly $2 million in local investment brought in another $21 million in funding from state, federal, and low-income housing tax credit resources. So I think one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of lay this out for you is I think, you know, a lot of our housing trusts are starting to accumulate significant resources, and housing trusts are trying to figure out, like, how should we be spending that money? And I want people to start thinking about how to be really strategic. So yes, through a housing trust, we could go out and spend $400,000 on buying a condo and making that, or a house, and turning it into an affordable home ownership or a home rental property. And that would serve the needs of one family. Or you, rather than take that $400,000, say that you took 5 of that model of spending $400,000 a unit, but you decided to, let's take $2 million and partner with a developer on a large project, and let's, for that same amount of money, create 65 units. That is going to be a much more efficient and strategic way of meeting our housing needs, because quite frankly, we don't have the time to meet the tremendous needs in our community, one condo or one house at a time. We really need to be looking at projects that have got some scale to be able to meet the tremendous needs that we have in our communities.
Jay, I also just want to highlight that the project timeline here shows that it took at least 4 years from the moment that the last RFP was issued. We didn't even talk about how they had multiple RFPs for that site. And I think one of the things that CPCs, community preservation committees, don't realize is that it can take a really long time. And so it's important to keep communication open with your other town committees who might be looking for results with a really quick turnaround. And that's just not how housing development works.
2 more quick things I want to say about this, Andrea, are so one of the reasons why a town needs to put money into a project. So there are two reasons. The first is that the state is going to require there to be local funds, because the state wants this to be a partnership between the state government and a local community, and to not be having the state coming in and imposing a housing development on a community. And so by the community coming together and deciding to invest in it, it proves to the state that this is a partnership. The other reason is that when you bring dollars to the table, you have a say. And by a town putting money into a project in a partnership, you now have the ability to influence what the project's going to look like and what needs that project will be made. Without money, and you don't get a seat at the table, and you don't get that input. And then, I'm sorry, can you go back one
Yeah.
real quick? One other thing to talk about too is, so you look at all those different sources of the Village of Nauset Green, and one of them is the town subsidy for infrastructure. So the town was able to use community development block grant money that it had in reserve to build the road. So like if you could take the building of the road and the water pipes and the wiring of the electricity out of the equation and covered that for the developer, then that gives the developer more resources to spend on construction using better materials and meeting some of the design requirements that a town might like. So I talked a little bit about property management, about why management matters. I mean, I think one of the other things too to remember about property management, particularly for affordable rentals, is managing affordable rentals is expensive. In 2016, Mass Housing Partnership did an analysis, and then they found that in southeastern Massachusetts, and remember that includes Plymouth and New Bedford and the Cape, it cost $8,400 per year per unit to manage a unit of affordable housing. Now think about that. If the rent on that unit is $12,000 a year that is coming in, and it's costing just to mow the lawn, fix things, do the income certification, market the property, identify long-term capital needs, report to all of those different funders. Remember I talked about at 12 units at Thankful Chases, we have 8 different funders. Well, that's just 8 different reports, eight different interactions that you have to have with those funders. All of that is adding up to $8,400 a year. That does not leave a whole lot of money to pay off the debt and finance the construction of those units. And so that is one of the reasons why subsidy is required. And here on the Cape, it is even more expensive than $8,000 per unit. Now, clearly, market rate units are a lot less expensive to manage. And the reason is that you don't have a lot of public money that has to be reported on. You also don't have to run lotteries and affordable fair housing marketing plans. You don't have to certify the income of all of the residents on an annual basis. All of those add extra costs to the annual operation and management of that unit. And so therefore, when you spread, however, if you decide, well, we don't really like big units in our community, and we'd really like to have no more than a couple rentals per site, that only increases the management costs. It is much more efficient to manage 65 units in one location that all have exactly the same water heater that was installed, the same kind of furnace, the same kind of infrastructure, that don't require the maintenance people, to be driving all day, fixing things and addressing things. It's a lot less expensive to manage 20 or more units in one site than if you're spreading those units all over a community or all over a region.
All right, so let's talk a bit about what we need to do as a region to get the best housing for our communities. Now, I have to start with community engagement. Because our legislative body is town meeting, residents actually play a really important role in land use policy, particularly around zoning. And it's not fair to expect residents to make helpful housing policy decisions without education, just like it's not fair to ask volunteer board and committee members to do so. And so community engagement, having a mechanism for community engagement, needs to be a well-oiled machine in your town. One of the first things that I want you to think about is who's going to do this work. In communities that are very high functioning around engagement, we see that there are lots of different players at the town level who are involved in housing production. And in really high functioning communities, they all serve a different purpose and have their own lane. And I think one of the patterns that I've observed over the past few years, and that doesn't get talked about enough, is that when a town is, say, changing the makeup of their affordable housing trust, and there was a group that was sort of the de facto housing advocacy body, they're two different bodies now, it can get a little confusing about who is doing what and why. And so it's really helpful to have conversations early on in the establishing of your trust, for example, about who is doing what. And we see that for a housing partnership or a local housing partnership or an affordable housing committee, which I think of interchangeably, it's really helpful for them to be the ones that are focused on suggesting new policy, doing the research, looking at best practices in other communities, and suggesting new strategies that a town could be implementing. And they really are the group that are best prepared to be doing the advocacy. So I would heavily lean on them around implementing a community engagement strategy. Your affordable housing trust, on the other hand, they're really about figuring out how trust funds can and should be used. They're focused on initiatives, specifically development, and they're stewarding the trust funds and reviewing applications for trust funds. They really are not meant to be doing the kind of advocacy and policy work that is best suited to your housing committees. The planning board, of course, should be focused on zoning. And then, of course, you need town staff because you need to actually have someone whose job it is to get the work done. And, it's no surprise that Provincetown is the closest to 10% of its year-round housing being affordable because they've had a housing coordinator on staff for the longest. Work doesn't get done unless it's someone's job to do it. And then, of course, towns should be planning to hire consultants to help with specific engagement projects when they arise. Like if you need to update your housing production plan, that's a really good time to hire a consultant to help you do some really slick community engagement to make sure that you're reaching diverse stakeholders. Community engagement can be used in a couple different scenarios. So one is for planning. You can also have engagement around a specific project, but you also need to be thinking about it on an ongoing basis. This work does not stop. This is a forever activity. So when we're talking about planning, we're talking about making sure that residents are playing a really important ongoing role throughout the planning process. It really does not help with buy-in in the long run if you are creating, say, a strategic plan and you don't get any resident buy-in. And then at the end, you say, here's a plan that the town came up with. We have a survey open, give us your feedback, and okay, we reviewed it and now we're done. The members of your town, the residents in your town, need to be providing input at the very beginning. And not only does this lead to the best possible plan, but it also makes sure that there's a shared vision about what our common goals are around housing or other things. And so there are a lot of different types of plans. In the housing space, we really focus on your housing production plan and your action plan. One thing I will say around a housing production plan is housing production plans are meant to lay out your strategy for producing affordable housing at those affordable income ranges. But as we discussed, we need a housing supply for people at all income ranges. And a housing production plan doesn't really do that. So we recommend that you please consider a comprehensive housing supply strategy for all of the members of your community at all income ranges included in your housing production plan. Or you can do something like what Provincetown does by having a housing playbook that is a lot more expansive in its vision. And again, the action plan is the plan that I highly recommend specifically for affordable housing trusts. So when you have an actual development in the pipeline, like Cloverleaf Intro, for example, you can expect that a developer will need to use 40B and apply for a comprehensive permit, which is going to kick off a set of public hearings through your zoning board of appeals. And these public hearings are where NIMBY sentiments are aired, as well as online. And you really need to be planning for that. It's an eventuality for pretty much every development because people don't really understand how affordable housing production works. So it's really important to have a community engagement strategy that you can roll out, not just for your planning process, but also for specific initiatives as they arise. And do be thinking about who is going to be doing the strategic organizing that's required, because your community engagement strategy should include, for example, talking points, the provision of talking points to people who are willing to show up at these hearings and speak in front of the ZBA. They might need to be prepared. They might be residents in your community who need housing and aren't comfortable speaking at these meetings, and they might need some more support. So making sure that the people who are prepared to advocate for housing know what to say, have arguments prepared, are organized in terms of showing up at meetings. And there's a lot of different meetings, so making sure that you have representation at all of the meetings. All of these things don't just happen organically. It requires a lot of preparation and strategy. So think about who in your community is best to do this. It may be your Affordable Housing Committee, or maybe you want to partner with a housing advocacy nonprofit in your town to help you with this. The other thing I want to say is that you can't expect the residents of your community to have agreement around support for housing if you don't model that same agreement at the municipal level. And so it's really important to be maintaining communication with all of the different housing players within the town, so that you demonstrate a shared vision at the municipal level, and that will trickle out into your community as well. And then ongoing education. I've mentioned this phrase before: create a culture of support. Make sure that you use language in municipal communications about what the needs of your community are and about how you're going to achieve your housing production goals. Make sure that this conversation is ongoing. One way of doing that is by posting on social media, or even just in the language and messaging that you're using in your planning documents, for example. But there needs to be consistency in the way that your town is talking about housing, and it needs to be really accessible. So just posting something on your website, for example, is only going to reach people who are constantly looking at your town website. So be thinking about all of the different ways that you're reaching your community. And this could be a whole training. It is a whole training just in itself. So I highly recommend that you look at the important work of Dr. Tiffany Manuel. Her website is thecasemaid.com, and she has some really great resources about how to make the case for housing production in your town. This list here is for you to refer back to. The point here is that there needs to be a lot of different ways for your residents to be able to interface with decision making. Having just straight up committee meetings where people have to show up and speak in front of a podium is not going to get the most diverse input that you can possibly get. And there are lots of other ways of structuring your meetings that can be more inclusive. And now with COVID, a lot of us are used to doing things remotely, which I think in some ways has opened up the conversation. So in order to be able to build more housing, we need to be able to build more densely, and we cannot do that without infrastructure. We talked about this a little bit before, but just to be clear, having municipal water, sewer, providing land, and access to transportation are all ways that you can use your local resources more effectively. And if you don't have these things, then you're really cut off from being able to meet the housing needs of your residents in an efficient manner. Jay, do you want to add anything there?
Oh, thank you. Covered it.
And we need to make it easier to build things other than single family detached homes on 1 acre lots, right? If we're not going to be able to meet our housing needs through that one mode of development, we need to have zoning that allows for alternatives. We talked a little bit about village centered. Transit oriented just means that people can walk to public transit. It means something a little bit different in metropolitan areas than it does in rural Cape Cod. But the idea is that even though our towns are small and rural, they can still be walkable. And that is something that is desired by not just young people, but also older people as well. We need to make it easy to build multifamily by right. And the reason why developers use Chapter 40B is because they have to. And if towns make it easier for developers to build multifamily housing, which is a more efficient way of building housing, then we cut out a lot of the cost there related to time, which drags out the process. We also need to allow for lots of alternative housing forms. So remember that graphic I showed you early on about missing middle. There needs to be lots of different housing types in your community that are allowed without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. we need to be looking at our accessory dwelling unit bylaws to make it easy for homeowners to be adding these units to their homes. The reason why towns love ADUs is that you can increase the number of housing units in your community without making any changes to allowable density, right? You're using the same number of bedrooms that are already allowed based on your septic, if you don't have sewer, which most of us don't. But you're increasing the number of households that piece of land can support. So you don't change the actual allowable density, and you don't put any new strains on infrastructure and on your water supply, because it's the same number of bedrooms that were already allowed to be there. You're just making it separate so that it can be a separate unit. And then another thing to think about around zoning is form-based code. I'm not going to get into it a lot, but form-based code is basically a completely different way of doing zoning, where you're focusing on design rather than use. So basic zoning is, residential, commercial, industrial. It focuses on how you're going to be using the land. And form-based code says, well, within reason, it doesn't really matter how you're using this building, right? Like, you can have a building here with a store, or you can have a building that is allowing 4 families to live there. We don't really care which bodies are in that space, but we do care what it looks like, and we care that it fits within the context of our communities. So we can actually establish design guidelines around how buildings should look in a certain area, but we're not going to police the humans that are inside that space and how they're using it. And the Cape Cod Commission has a great guidebook on form-based code. And of course, we need money. We can't build housing without money. State subsidies are only serving one slice of our housing need. If we want to be serving the full range of housing need at middle income levels included, we need to be putting significant local resources down in service of that need. The only well, it's not even super significant funding source that I'm aware of that supports housing for people up to 120% AMI is the Workforce Housing Fund through Mass Housing. And it's not a big pot of money. And I think it was used up pretty quickly during the beginning of the funding cycle. A little note there on messaging. Workforce housing is the term that we use to refer to people between 80 or 100% and 120% of area median income. But it's really discriminatory, and we really need a better term. The assumption is that people who have lower income levels are not working, which of course is not the case. So some people use community housing, some people use social housing. We need a better term, and I just want to put that out there. The same reason why we don't use tenants, because the origins of that word are really derogatory. We refer to people as residents rather than tenants. So it's something to keep in mind. As far as funding, we talked a little bit about the different sources of funding. I'm not going to get into all of these, but one thing I do want you to think about is that when it comes to Community Preservation Act funding, which is one of the largest sources of local funding that we have here, there is a requirement that 10% of the pot of money that CPCs are stewarding has to be dedicated to housing, but that's a minimum, not a maximum. You could increase that allocation, and you could also have your CPA allocation for housing automatically transferred to the trust rather than having your trust apply for those funds on an annual basis. And the nice thing about that is it becomes funding that the trust can expect and use in their long-term planning. For more information about funding sources, check out this link. Probably the most important tool around funding is just making sure that you have a really strong housing trust. The reason why a housing trust is so important is that a trust doesn't have to wait for annual town meeting to move on a piece of real estate. So, if a town finds a site that's perfectly suited for land and they don't have a trust, they have to wait until town meeting to approve the purchase of that land. But we all know that that is not how the real estate market works. No one's going to sit around waiting for a town to approve that request. So a housing trust can say, okay, these are our housing production goals. We know that we want to get X number of acres that are zoned in X number of ways or this way. And, if we find a site that ticks all of the boxes that exists within our action plan and our development strategy, then we can just jump on that because we know how much money we have, and the parameters of the trust are that we are allowed to make that purchase. So making sure that you have a strong municipal affordable housing trust is absolutely key to your housing production strategy. Most towns have or are in the process of switching over to a municipal affordable housing trust, which is a different makeup. In some towns, your housing trust is actually just your select board. But a municipal affordable housing trust has a more diverse makeup. And there are a lot of reasons why that is a good idea to consider. And MHP not only provides Massachusetts Housing Partnership, not only provides great resources about how to establish a trust, they also provide technical assistance for groups that are working on transitioning over to the new municipal affordable housing trust, the new version. Oh, I guess the other thing I want to say about strengthening your housing trust is your trust can't do anything without money. So make sure that you have really clear and strong funding sources that are constantly going into your trust so that they actually have resources to use. And it seems like a no-brainer, but it's actually a new thing that towns are getting on this bandwagon. If you want to have a lot of different, if you want to implement a lot of different housing production strategies at once, it needs to be someone's job to move these along. It's really complicated. It's a lot of work. It's not something that volunteer boards should be expected to do. You need to have someone, whether it's part-time or full-time, whose job it is to work on housing. And it's been really exciting over the past few years since we started the Housing Institute to watch towns really understand that and start hiring staff. And then I would also say that we need more sources of unrestricted funding to meet the various needs in our community. And on a citizen level, you can be advocating for more funding. And these are two organizations that are really focused on housing policy that you might want to connect with. And then the last thing I'll say about this is regional collaboration. You know, people are really focused on producing housing within their town, but it is perfectly normal and reasonable that someone will live in one town and work in another town. And the housing market just really doesn't respect town lines. And given that housing production is so expensive and there is a varying accessibility to available developable land, it does make sense in some towns to support projects in other towns. We don't want to see situations where towns are only throwing money at housing in other towns because they don't want any affordable housing in their own town. It's not an either or, it's an and. But we do see that there are towns that are recognizing the value of increasing housing production in the region overall. You know, the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. And Village at Nauset Green is the most recent example of Wellfleet and Orleans both contributing $100,000 to Eastham for that project. Now, the elephant in the room is that, right, if you give money to a project that is not in your town, you will not be able to count those units on your subsidized housing inventory. And I think there's a good argument for moving away from increasing SHI units as the only determinants of success. It's an important one, but in communities where you're not as concerned about so-called unfriendly 40Bs, you have a little bit more leeway to be supporting development in other communities as well. All right. So we did it. We got through with time to answer some questions right on time. I do want you to be aware that we do have more training opportunities coming up. So Housing 101 was today. We have a training on the RFP process, as I mentioned, in March. And then we also have a training on affordable housing trusts and CPA. That's going to be in April. A really key conversation that we're hoping to have in that training is around how trusts can be working better with the affordable housing committees in their town, with the community preservation committees in their town, with the select board, just how all of the different housing players within a town can be working in more alignment. We are also offering a housing coordinator training. We're probably going to hold it in May. This is actually a training for a very small audience because there's not a lot of housing staff on the Lower Cape, but we brought it this year because we have two towns that have hired or are in the process of hiring housing staff. Orleans has Marcia, I believe, is in the training. And also we're waiting for Eastham to hire a housing coordinator, which are really exciting developments for our region. So as soon as Eastham hires someone, we will be scheduling that training. And we have also opened it up to town staff who are working on housing. So if you are someone who works for the town and are working on housing and would benefit from that, please get in touch with me and we would love to invite you to join us. And then, like I mentioned in the beginning, we are going to be offering these sub-regional quarterly peer group meetings. Our spring meetings are going to take place in April, and our summer meetings will take place in June, and then we'll schedule out the ones for the rest of the year. These peer group meetings are really lovely, informal opportunities for people in neighboring towns to get together and talk about what they're working on. We recognized early on in the Housing Institute that these opportunities simply didn't exist, and a lot of towns had no idea what their neighbors were working on, and they were working on, you know, finding solutions to the same problems. So we commiserate a little bit, but we also just share best practices and talk to each other about what is really successful and how successes were achieved. So those are fun, smaller meetings. And then once town meetings have kicked off, I know that we're still waiting to find out exactly when they're going to take place in some towns. We will have this housing article summary put together, and we share that through our e-newsletter, which is the last thing I want to say to you, which is that we have this monthly e-newsletter that we'll be linking to, and it's a really important way to find out what else is coming up from the CDP and what's going on in the region. Jay, anything to add before we move to questions?
No, let's turn to questions. Do you want
All right, so
go to the
I'm going
chat?
to open this up and just read through them. And I'm gonna let you take these, Jay.
You'll chime in some of them.
Yeah. Okay, so early in the beginning, someone asked why year 2025. I think that was referring to the affordability gap charts. And that was just the time range that the Cape Cod Commission was looking into for their projected data. I think their current data went up to 2015, and then they projected out an additional 10 years. So I would have to ask you'd have to ask the Cape Cod Commission about that. Jay, do you know what the 200 counties are in the US that don't have that
I do
gap?
not. That statistic comes from the low-income housing the Low-Income Housing Association in Washington. But I will do a little research and see if I can find out what those 200 communities are. But clearly, those counties are those are not counties on the coasts or where there's booming economy. I mean, I think this affordability gap now, spreading, across the country is really one of the products of the tremendous income inequality that there is in the U.S. And so it's really where we're seeing, in healthy booming economies, or so-called healthy booming economies, that's where the housing challenges are most acute.
Somebody asked how we're going to be able to access this presentation after the training. So we are going to share a link to this Prezi. And the reason why we decided to do that is that we're going to keep improving it and adding resources to it. So you can come back to this as a live resource. They're not just going to be static slides. So that'll be in the follow-up information. We do send our emails through Salesforce, which is has an automated messaging system. So if you don't hear from me in the next couple of days, check your junk or spam folder, because for some people, our emails end up there. You can always email me directly. Okay, somebody asked, looking at wage earnings by industry, does seasonality affect the income for accommodation, food services, and retail when comparing these industries to healthcare and construction? So that's referring to the how many earners does it take? I don't know the answer to
So
that.
the statistics that were used in that chart do incorporate seasonality. And so clearly one of the drivers of our housing affordability challenges are the lower wage seasonal jobs that we have in our community that make it really difficult, even if you're working hard and trying to earn a good living for 8 months out of the year and collecting unemployment in the winter. That is not providing an income that's enough to compete with a retiree or a second homeowner who's got a 6-figure plus income and can afford the housing. It's that income. It's the retiree and the second homeowner's incomes and buying power that drive the cost of our housing.
And then the same person asked, how does the affordability gap tell you how many housing units are needed in a community?
Well, so, I mean, what you can do is, when you go and do a housing needs assessment for your individual community, there are a number of consultants who do those needs assessments. using data, they can quantify the number of housing units that you need at various cost levels that are driven by the incomes that people are making in your community.
Next question. I've always thought the requirement should be if seniors and disabled are on the first floor and open to everyone on the second floor. Is that possible to enforce?
So when it comes to accessibility for affordable housing, most of that is driven by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you have to comply with that. And a certain number of the units are going to have to be fully ADA compliant. And all of the units are going to need to be visitable. And so what that often translates into is that in a building that is multifamily units that's more than one story, you're going to need an elevator. One of the challenges there too becomes how many stories that building is. And one of the big controversies on some projects has been, oh my God, a 3-story building. And the reality is, the cost and economics of building is that elevator an elevator is going to cost you $100,000. And if you can have that elevator serve 3 floors as opposed to 2 floors, that's driving the cost of the project down. And we can build 3-story buildings that have pitched roofs and are designed in a way that they don't look like these massive, huge buildings. But if we can build 3-story buildings, we start bringing down the cost of the per unit cost for creating housing.
Is restraining housing costs to 30% of income realistic in an area like Cape Cod that is so desirable?
Well, so it really is an issue of kind of what kind of community do we want to live in? And if we don't kind of stick to that 30% of income for housing, we're going to pay for it in other ways. So that just means that we're going to, if families are paying more than 30% of their income, they don't have resources for healthcare, for emergencies. And so we're going to need other less efficient ways of making up that difference. And so certainly it becomes more challenging in a desirable area to enforce that. But it really comes down to the quality of life. And the good news is, though, that our communities do have resources to help meet that need. We have very healthy real estate tax bases. I know that people will express concerns about our taxes, but talk to the average second homeowner about what they pay for their $1 million house on Cape Cod versus what they pay for their $1 million house in Connecticut. And their property taxes here are really low. And those property taxes can provide the resources to our communities to help make up this kind of gap.
Jay, what's the difference between prevailing wage and what developers provide? And what about a just and living wage on the Cape?
I'm going to wonder if Michelle Jurashevitz might know what the differential is, or maybe Jillian Douglas might know what it is. I think it's about a 40% difference between what prevailing wages are and what regular wages are. Do either of you know what the inflation rate is?
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
I'm not actually up on the current, and I think the Cape Cod Commission does do the local living wage. They follow that statistic and report it. And I think that's probably a really important one for this group to focus on, because that, and also tying into what you had just said about how towns supplement, for instance, childcare vouchers. If the cost of your housing or your cost of living includes a very high childcare cost, towns can supplement in that respect, or publicly we could subsidize housing in that way. I'll stop there.
So does the CDP have experts to write and evaluate RFPs? We do not, but Mass Housing Partnership does. And we're happy to help towns connect with those resources to help with the development of RFPs.
Will private developers have to meet requirements of filed sub-bid law?
I don't know what that is.
I don't either. Olga, do you want to clarify?
Yes, file sub-bid laws go along with prevailing wage in state and federal projects, or I guess state projects. It means that a general contractor has to show his subcontractors so that local people will have a chance rather than a general contractor just picking his usual group of contractors.
So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, Olga, but let me kind of just share with you just some experiences about some recent projects that have been built. The fact is that our trades people on the Cape are very busy. And they're making a lot more money building $1 million houses than affordable housing projects. And so, what often happens is when Delphi Construction or one of these larger construction companies that comes in to do a large project, they often end up with subs and bringing workers in to do that, just because we don't have the construction workforce here. And if you talk, Matt Cole from Cape Associates is the president of the CDP board, and shares with me all the time that they don't have enough employees as a construction company. And so, I've heard at some public hearings, people express this concern, well, why can't we hire local people? And the fact is that there aren't local construction folks to do this kind of work because they're so busy with the existing projects that are that happen on the Cape.
Jay, this is Harry. Filed sub-bids are an artifact of the public construction law. So it's municipal construction projects over a certain size limit. And so they don't apply to private developers.
Private
It's
development. Okay.
Just government construction projects.
Just government. Thank you.
Next question is there specific guidance on what the risks are for public construction and how to avoid? Yes, so MHP has a document that they're actually working on updating and publishing soon, and it's the basis of our RFP process training. So the answer is yes, and that is the entire training that we're offering in March.
And it is really, really, really important for a municipality to be very careful about not crossing that line in the support and planning that it provides to a project. Because there's great interest with organized labor, and I'm a pro-union guy, but on the other hand, we need to build housing, and there have been, not on the Cape but in other parts of the Commonwealth, some private developer projects that have been challenged because the municipality was too involved and kind of tripped the requirements of what a municipality can do to support a project, yet keep it as a non-municipal building project. But again, these are not the kinds of things that Housing Trust and Housing Committee members need to really worry about. That town staff, and these are kind of the resources too that Mass Housing Partnership can provide in helping a town make sure that it stays within the constraints that it can in the pre-development process.
Jay, why lease town-owned land rather than fee simple with deed restrictions for affordable in perpetuity?
So I believe that that the lease is what enables the project to be a private project and not trip municipal procurement. The other reason, though, for a lease is usually those leases have no cost attached to them. So, for example, the Village at Nauset Green is built on on 11 acres of land that's owned by the town of Eastham. There is no rent on that. So what you have just done is you removed several $1 million of the cost of that project, because basically the developer is getting the land for free. But by having it be leased, the town is able to maintain some control because they're the landlord. I think it's also a bit more palatable to go to town meeting to get a town vote, to tell the town we're going to still own the land and have control over it, rather than we're giving the land to some private entity to develop. That reminds me of another kind of fact that can often be helpful. We've also often heard complaints in zoning hearings about a for-profit developer coming in and making money off of affordable housing. And the reality is that we do live in a capitalist society, but the amount of money that private for-profit developers and nonprofit developers can make on affordable housing is capped, and it's capped at 20%. And that is a much lower cap than developers who are building huge luxury homes. So you know, there is a cap on how much profit a for-profit developer can make.
Jay, before we keep going, I want to acknowledge that it's 12:02. And so if anyone needs to leave, we will not be offended, but we are going to stay here and keep answering questions, and you're all welcome to stay with us. The next question is, when a town creates an RFP for affordable housing, it's essentially a 40B project in consideration of zoning, density, and other variances that will be required. Does the town first submit the RFP to the proper boards for approval, as well as hold community input meetings?
No. So submitting the RFP to a zoning board would trigger a municipal building project. So certainly, you know, the criteria that a ZBA has on a 40B is very clear. You know, there isn't a whole lot of latitude for discretion. You know, the law is the ZBA really has to provide relief. You know, as long as that there are no, you know, as long as safety and health requirements are met, there just isn't a compelling reason for a ZBA to deny a permit. The other thing too is an RFP is not going to get into the level of detail that a ZBA is going to look at. So that's the other reason why it wouldn't get approved by a ZBA.
As far as the community
Certainly,
input,
you know, ZBA members could attend a public forum and comment, but not in their official capacity as a zoning board meeting and reviewing it.
yeah. And I've seen 2 different examples of some communities will do community engagement as part of the process of developing an RFP. And some communities will put together the bones of an RFP and then go to the community for input on that RFP. I've seen it done both ways. There isn't one way that's better than the other. I think it depends on your community, but personally, I think there's a lot of value in engaging the community early on in the process before you write one.
I think I answered these next 2 questions about the infrastructure that the town subsidy at Village at Nauset Green helped pay for the road and the site work. There's also another really great source that towns can use for that kind of pre-development site work is the Mass Works program. And Truro and Brewster have both used Mass Works. So for example, at the Truro project at the Cloverleaf, a $1 million Mass Works grant brought public water to the site and is also providing some resources for, you know, building the road and kind of building out the infrastructure.
A little bit about management. Why is it so expensive compared to the private sector?
I think I talked a bit about that it's not just the simple act of making repairs on things, that you have a whole, because you're using public funds, there's a whole level of compliance. So if the state is putting money in, they're requiring that the residents have their income certified every year, that you do a marketing plan that meets fair housing requirements and provides opportunity, equal opportunity to access that housing, that all of the financing and the operation needs to be reported to the different funders. And so those are the kinds of things that drive up the costs of management.
Is there a rule of thumb for minimum size of project to justify LIHTC or the low income housing tax credit, especially on the Cape?
I think off the top of my head, I believe that it's 28 units are required. 28 units or more for a low income housing tax credit project. I have seen some projects that were kind of done together within the same town that totaled 28, that were able to split the tax credits into two different buildings or on two different sites, but the project was kind of done simultaneously.
Next question, what can the CDP do to promote and encourage non-governmental market rate community workforce housing? I mean, I think one of the things we can do is have this program, the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership, and advocate for zoning reform through our advocacy program. What else would you say?
The other thing I just think it's important to point out is I don't know that it is possible to build workforce housing without some degree of subsidy. Our costs of construction and land are so high, and our labor costs and material costs, and then coupled with that, with the rent that working people on the Cape can afford. I just don't think that the numbers really work that well, unless you're doing very high density. Patrick, the numbers may work on the project you're working on in Provincetown because you're achieving pretty high density and doing temporary seasonal workers. But when it comes down to folks, a family with two incomes that add up to about 100,000. There just isn't enough money coming into that family to pay a rent or a purchase price that pays for the cost of building that unit.
Jay, can I just comment that the accessory dwelling units is the way that locally we've responded to that, because it is a way that those are not subsidized units generally.
Correct.
And that can certainly help if we can get more of them.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have run, like if you are able within your house to create an accessory dwelling unit and say it costs you $100,000 and you're able to charge $1,000 to $1,400 a month rent, actually then the numbers work. You could probably get a homeowner could get a HELOC on their home, pay for the creation of that unit, and have enough income coming in to pay off that HELOC and actually provide some extra income onto that family. The key is, what is the zoning in the town and how easy is it for the homeowner to create that unit? And when we start making them having to go to a ZBA and go through all of those costs, that becomes a real barrier to homeowners who aren't developers, they're just homeowners who want to create an apartment. And that creates a real barrier to getting those units created.
How about bonding for housing through CPC funding?
That is a great strategy. And that is also one of the beauties of having this a majority, if not all of your CPC money just going to the housing trust, is that it gives the housing trust a steady income stream with which to go out and borrow money and then pay it off, just like was often done on open space purchases. You go out and borrow a couple $1 million to buy a big parcel of land and pay it off over 20 years. That's a great strategy for housing, is to be able to go out and borrow a couple $1 million, pay it off over 20 years, and get that housing built right away.
Someone asked, can you talk a little bit more about the shift you mentioned for trust to switch to the different format, municipal affordable housing trust, and why it's occurring? What are some benefits? What are some drawbacks? I think there are two main things. One of them is that there is a lot of value when it comes from having a shared community vision, to have the members of your trust include members of the community. So in a municipal affordable housing trust, you include members of various boards and committees who are already deeply involved in housing decision making. You have a CPC liaison, you have a bunch of different seats, and there's also some members at large that are public citizens. And so when you have, just like in a office environment, diversity is always going to lead to the best outcomes. When you have diversity of thoughts and experience, you have better outcomes in housing production decision making overall. I think one of the reasons why the switch is happening in towns is that when your trust is your select board is very busy. And there are a lot of examples of towns where the trust is the select board and the trust simply does not meet because the select board is meeting, every other week and working on a million other issues. So having a separate trust with a separate group of people who are really laser focused, make sure that they are able to advance housing initiatives, and B, lets them get into the minutia of, say, working on a specific development that a select board doesn't have the bandwidth for. The only drawback I can think of is what I alluded to earlier, which is if you already have, say you have a town where the select board has been the trust forever, and then you switch over to the municipal affordable housing trust model, which is a whole new board, then the select board is used to working on housing to a certain degree, and they might get a little bogged down in the minutia that is really no longer their problem, basically, right? It's really the trust responsibility to be thinking about these questions. And another example would be if your affordable housing committee has always been working on, looking for land for housing, and all of a sudden you have a trust and it's their job to be looking for land for housing. When you have these historical patterns that people are used to getting locked into a certain role, it can be really difficult to extract them and separate them out. And this is easily managed by just having a good process to delineate roles, but it's just the way that humans work. It can take some time for people to get comfortable in their new roles and be clear about what the differentiation is between them. And in the meantime, they might just keep trying to do the same thing for a while before they kind of land on a separation of powers, so to speak. Let's see. We already have density in, quote, under the radar, illegal, sometimes unsanitary accessory dwelling units. How do we call out these units to bring them up to building and sanitary codes without causing evictions? Amnesty programs?
I was going to say that.
Yeah. I don't know. Does anyone else have a thought? I mean, I think one of the things is making sure that your town actually has the capacity to monitor these units to begin with. That's a challenge in a lot of towns. Do you have anything else to add on that, Jay? I don't.
Yeah, I mean, some towns do. Eastham and Provincetown both have rental registration programs that do involve inspections. I believe Provincetown inspects every 3 years. So that is certainly one mechanism where you're actually going out and inspecting the units.
Well, that's all the questions. We got to all of them. Great, and it's 12:13. So Jay, unless you have some closing thoughts, I think I want to thank everybody for sticking with us through the end and being guinea pigs. We're going to be sending out a lot of follow-up materials. We would love for you to sign up for our upcoming trainings. But more importantly, we would love for you to complete an evaluation to let us know how we did, what's missing, and how we can make this better. Any closing thoughts, Jay?
I think you covered it all, Andrea.
All right, everyone, have a great weekend.
Thanks.
And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.